will be our gaffer, and he will be doing the demonstration for us, and maybe have some assistance from Jake as well. In the studio, we have over where Jake is standing is a furnace that holds 750 pounds of molten glass at about 2,150 degrees. On the inside is a crucible where all the glass sits, and it's completely clear. Colored glass is something that we would add to the glass later to add any type of effect we like. The next piece of equipment we have down the line is a pipe warmer, and this is where we have all of our stainless steel solid rods and blowpipes, and the blowpipes are what we typically use to blow bubbles into glass. The reason why we have a pipe warmer is because the metal needs to be heated to a nice cherry red color in order for it to have glass adhered to it. And then the final piece of equipment that we have on both sides of this hood is a reheating chamber, and inside of a reheating chamber is just a massive fire pit that allows us to reheat the glass when we need it to be reheated. Right now, at the moment, Steve has a piece of color bar on his punchy rod, and he's loading half of it into our reheating chamber here for picking up later. He will use that color in a later piece. Now he has the color loaded. He's going to do whatever setup he needs to do in order to prepare for the project he'll be working on today. And the story that he chose, a general theme that we've been working on throughout our other demonstrations, is the stone and the sword. The sword and the stone, sorry. So we're about to get started here. Steve will be picking up a hollow blowpipe. One end of the rod has a hole all the way through so he can blow into it. And he'll be gathering up a certain amount of clear molten glass off the end. And sometimes, you know, we have the liberty to restart whenever we need to. Wants to make sure that the pipe is nice and straight. You can see the cherry red glow on the end, and that's what ensures us to be able to gather glass out of the furnace. If the pipe was cold without any color, it more than likely wouldn't be able to take the glass onto the rod itself. What Steve is doing right now is he's straightening the pipe. He's finding the high side. There's lots of different ways to do this. It's very rudimentary. And when you have years of experience like Steve does, he can bang the pipes around whenever he likes to straighten them. So now once again, it gathers a little bit of glass off the end and blows through it, and that bubble that's super, super thin now has a clear entryway for air to pass through that pipe while molten glass is on it. This is what we call a post. He's going to use this glass on the post to pick up a piece of color after he shapes it. He's using the tweezers to go around the end of the glass to make it what looks like a little crown, and clean up the edge with these straight shears. When the glass is so hot, you can actually cut it kind of like you would with taffy. It's very, very malleable, and with the shears are sharp enough, they can cut right through the molten glass. And that's one way that glass blowing is so interesting. And just glass is an interesting material, how you can manipulate it. So when Steve split this color bar, this solid piece of color, and he put it in the kiln, that's where this post is, that's why this post is important. To a little final shape, he's going to go into the color box and stab up the color. And now he has a little bit of color off the end of the blowpipe that he can heat into a colored gather. The form that he'll be making today is based off of the stone, the sword and the stone. And he'll be focusing on the story where Arthur meets Merlin, and Merlin has two owls, one named Archimedes, and it's like a little friend. So when we're heating objects in our reheat chambers, the glass gets so hot that it starts to homogenize on itself, and which means that it just comes together in a more even way. All the molecules line up and everything is kind of crazy, but things start to smooth out and we can redistribute glass to areas that we want it to. Right now, Steve is using a pair of jacks, which were probably derived from sheep shears about 3,000 years ago, and have become this modernized tool that is the tool that a glassblower can use to pretty much make anything. A skilled glassblower can make a cup with just the jacks. It's a very versatile tool, a very loved tool. Now he's getting another gather of clear glass over top of his original gather with all that color, and he just stripped off whatever material he didn't want.
I mean, it doesn't really matter. That's way hotter than it ought to be.
So now he's using a tool called a block. It's made out of cherry wood, and it allows us to shape the glass and redistribute the material in a way that's useful to the glassblower. And then afterwards he goes in for a reheat, and that's to allow the cooler glass that was the color to reheat itself and be the same temperature as the outside material. So as we're working glass, we have lots of tools to our disposal. And one of them is a stainless steel Marv table that Steve was just on, as well as our breath. And he just did, so he put a little bit of air into the end of that pipe and capped it with his thumb, which allows the air to expand from the heat, which blows a bubble directly into the center of that glass. And then the swing isn't just for show. He's allowing gravity and from the movement to move that glass in a way that he wants into this gathering shape. Another tool he's using, this is just compressed air. He's using it to super cool the surface of the gather. He wants to make sure that he's not too hot before he goes into the furnace, or else all the glass could move his bubble in an adverse way and make it very difficult for him to use the material. Now he has another strip. Whenever we gather glass out of the furnace, it's as if the material immediately it grows exponentially. Now he's using a slightly larger block in order to shape and cool the glass at the same time, make it all nice and even. And over on the other side, we have a machine that sends cool water to the base of the pipe, allowing it to, it's a slow conductor of heat. It still draws a lot. heat up top, so we want to make sure we protect ourselves. A common question people ask is that why don't we wear gloves? And usually it's that gloves take away the mobility that we have in our fingers in order to move the pipe 360 degrees. Wearing gloves can also be very cumbersome to the glass blower. And sometimes people opt to use them if they're working on larger objects that radiate a lot more heat. So after that heat, he's doing another swing, which allows the glass to elongate. Now he's using the jacks to create what's known as a jack line. It's a small constriction closest to the head of the pipe that will ultimately allow him to break the piece off of the pipe, freeing it so that we can anneal it. But also he's using the jacks to shape the bubble. Using another swing and some air, further elongating the form, and then going back with the jacks to elongate and squeeze. How Steve is doing?
Yep.
Steve, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you.
Well, he's fine.
I think it's a little personal.
It's a
little inappropriate.
You can thank them for their comment.
Well, thank you for your comment. Steve very much appreciates the love and support.
Yeah, what he said.
So now he's just allowing the glass to cool down, and I believe now we're going to begin a less than traditional form of blowing glass, which is
Maybe a third time.
okay. So three very specific steps in order to achieve this owl sculpture. In traditional glass blowing, we want to encase the entirety of the bubble all in molten clear glass, and that's if you were just to blow a form like a cup or a vase or a bowl. But in this instance, he's only dipping maybe half or a quarter of the bubble into the furnace to gather just half of the form. And this is for this very specific type of sculpture of this owl. This will be the little owl. And now he's using a tag, which is a stainless steel spatula essentially, to create creases out of that fresh molten glass directly on the bubble. You can also create nice flat sides for bases. And now to cool the glass again so that he can do another dip on the bubble.
Yeah, we'll do this twice on the little one and probably 3 times on the big one.
Okay.
Makes sense.
So when doing a sculpture, whatever excess clear he doesn't need, he's utilizing the fact that when he went and creased it the first time, the second layer of clear traps air bubbles and adds a layer of depth to the work. We can use the shears, the straight shears that are like scissors we used earlier, to crimp these little sections, makes little creases, pinch marks. You need to draw material up, really accentuate all that new material that was added to the bubble, and use the tweezers to mold and shape the clear glass. So typically when we're using, when we're in our hot shop and blowing glass, it's typically a team sport. Everything is mostly done with a team member. But in this case, Steve is doing everything mostly by himself. And that's just personal preference. You don't have to work with a partner, but there are some things in glass that are harder to do without a partner. We use this nifty tool to just hang the pipe from a collar. The glass is cold enough so that it's not going to fall to the floor as if it were hot. If you were to do this with fresh glass or even just very warm glass, that form that he specifically has been focusing on could fall to the floor. Right now he uses a little tiny bit of glass on the end of this larger punty rod, and he'll be using called a punty. A little bit of glass off the end is shaped to a very specific shape, and we use as a connection point to transfer one side of the piece to the other. So he worked from the bottom, he's made the base of the owl, and now he's going to work on the top. And when we were working with great skill, such as this, he can do everything by himself, attach the punty as an assistant would. He's using the tweezers to chill that jack line. Nice and easy, the pipe goes free, and now he's free to use anything on the top of the
So I'll show you what I've got so far, because now it's right side up.
Okay.
So this is what we've got so far. And I know it doesn't look like much, you're just going to have to trust me.
Making anything out of glass, especially when it comes to sculpture, is an amazing process because you create from nothing. A clear molten blob, it's colorized or not, texturized, and then you can make brilliant forms like owls and other fun things like that. You can make literally anything out of glass. I was using a very hot torch it's a Ranger type. It's fueled by propane and oxygen. There's a premix inside of it, and the flame burns at about 3,500 degrees. And this flame is very important in sculpture, especially because it allows you to superheat section. You'll end up superheating the overall form, which could deform it. So that's why this torch is a specialized tool. I was using these diamond shears, which are just basically diamond-shaped scissors, to create small constriction lines around the piece to remove material. And while glass blowing is an additive process, it is also a reductive process. But we can keep adding or removing as much as we like until there's basically nothing left. Now he's closed off the form. He's going to use the hot torch again to preheat a section that he's going to sculpt in the future. Glass is very amazing because it remembers heat. It has a very good heat memory, so wherever it's hottest, it will remember. Which is why it will move. Like when we use gravity, it will remember to move. So it seems like Steve's going in for another one of those uneven dips in the glass to add the head to the owl. trim the excess off. We're smoothing glass out the taglio, make it nice and even. And then he can start to pull and manipulate the material to make the head of this owl. He's being very specific and precise on how he's manipulating the material. Watching it. Looks like we're going to do another dip in the furnace. Add more material to the top. And as I said earlier, he could have Jake, who's opening the door for him, to give him bits to add glass to the surface, wherever he wanted, but this way he can add thicker amounts of glass without having to worry about having very specific shapes of bits added to the glass. So now he's pulling out the beak and looks like the ears. So this is just one owl of two that Steve will be making. And sometimes when you're unfamiliar with the form, it's good to make it small before you make it large, so that you can understand all the kinks that you have to work out in order to make it as delightful as you like. Now he's spot heating with that torch again. Make sure that he can move the material that he wants without moving the entirety of the head, for instance. If he were to put and let the glass get as hot as it is inside of the reheat chamber, the owl would get all sorts of deformed. So now he can just pinch, and we can observe the malleability of the material. As it cools, as it gets thinner, it cools, so he can stretch it. Use a little bit of water in the coldness of his tweezers to just tip off that little tiny piece of glass. Now he's going in for the final touches. Whenever you manipulate glass with a tool, it has a tendency to create chill marks on the glass. So if you were to try and sell it in a shop, maybe that wouldn't, people don't want to see chill marks on glass. So we can round out that material texture using the hot torch as well. And also manipulate the ears, or whatever, or whichever part he's using. Periodically is to make sure that the whole form is what we call flashing, to bring it back up to an atmosphere that's closer to hotter than it is colder. Because as glass in the outside atmosphere cools at a very, cools down at a very quick rate. So if we do not constantly reheat the glass, it will shrink on itself and crack. This glass, when it's hot, it actually expands. It expands a little bit, not by much, but expands enough so that then that's why it moves. But as it gets cooler, it will contract on itself while it's still hot on the inside, and that's what causes the glass to crack. All right, and now we can see the little owl. Very cute.
Okay.
All right, so now that Steve understands how he's going to make the larger owl, this would probably be like the son of the pet owl of Archimedes from the story of Sword in the Stone. And I'll get a little bit more into that when we start the next piece. Right now, Steve put a little bit of water on the end of his shears, and that water inside of the punchy mark allows us to break free the glass. It thermally shocks the material, making it brittle, and then Jake takes the piece away and puts it in our annealing oven. And I'll talk about annealing later when we're finished with our demonstration. Mm-hmm. All right, so Steve is doing the same type of prep that he did for the first one, where he has his hollow blowpipe. He's going to put a little bit of glass on the end of it, blow through it so that it has a hole, and then stab up some color. In the meantime, he's just cleaning off the pipe to make sure that it has a hole through it, so he doesn't run into any complications. And still straightening up that pipe, just make sure it's as nice and straight as it possibly can be. Okay. So the story of the Sword in the Stone is about young King Arthur, who is going through life, and he meets a wizard named Merlin, who becomes his mentor, and he teaches him many things and turns him into many animals to describe and to teach him about things in life. And the elderly wizard lives with a talking pet owl named Archimedes, and that is the larger version that Steve is going to make today. Archimedes, the owl, is a very wise owl, and there's a lot of things in that story that teach us about wisdom and to be nice. So now that Steve has removed excess glass from his post, he's just getting it hot so he can put more color on the end of his blowpipe. Inside of our color box, he steps up a little bit of color. It's a solid color bar. There's lots of different ways to apply color to glass. One way is so the solid color bar is completely saturated with a certain pigment of color. Every color is made with a different type of element. So I believe this is the same type of pink. There's a little bit of gold that's added to make pink, as well as maybe some cadmium and maybe some other types of elements. There's a full range of colors that are available in glass and in different types of saturations, including transparent and opaque. And there's fascinating processes on how to make all those colors. There are also other forms of color, such as frit or powder. And frit is basically this bar that's been chopped up into smaller or larger pieces of glass that we can coat on the outside or inside of our bubbles. And then powder is like what it sounds, it's like flour. A very, very fine type of color that can be placed around bubbles and other types of forms to give a soft texture. Right now, Steve's using the Marver table. It sucks heat out of the glass, but also shapes the glass. And he wants to have a very specific shape for this gather. You can use the compressed air to super cool the surface of the glass. Now he's adding another layer of clear glass, fully encapsulating the color and cooling the pipe with water at our pipe cooling station, because the pipe gets hot as it gets heated over and over and over again. We have a larger Marver table over there where he's able to redistribute that new molten glass, and then to further that process he uses this wooden block which is made out of cherry wood. It holds water in its wood very, very well, so he's able to easily shape and cool the glass in the way that he wants. Now this fresh layer of molten glass is the hottest part of this gather. While the inside, the bubble, it looks very hot, but it's actually several hundred degrees cooler than the outside. So the reason why he wants to reheat the glass is so that all of the glass inside the bubble and the outside is the exact same temperature. We call this a homogenization, where all the material is the same temperature. All the particles are lining up together. Now what he's doing, he puts a little tiny bit of air into the end of the blowpipe and with his thumb over top. And what happens is that the air gets superheated and shoots up to the pressure, can put a bubble into glass very easily. So if you were to blow too hard, the material, if it's really hot, would expand too quickly, thus making an unstable form. Now Steve's going in for another layer of glass. The glass kind of gets exponentially thicker as we add more material to it. Another nice layer of clear molten glass. And the same process begins again. Well, he'll use the block to cool the glass, to redistribute the material into the form that he would like. He's using the Marver to push the material further to the tip of the bubble. So he has a thicker layer. And also to cool the tip too, so that when he blows and inflates the glass, it doesn't, the glass bubble doesn't want to shoot all the way to the tip. Sometimes these are described as resistances. The tools that we apply to the glass create cold, essentially cold surfaces on top. And this resistance is what helps us blow forms that we intend to make. So he's hanging the bubble down, inflating the glass, utilizing gravity. Now he's super cooling with the compressed air again. Jake is going to use what's called a rake. It's a metal push bar like you would for like hockey, and he's able to push the surface of the molten glass back to the opposite side. He's literally raking the furnace, and why we do that is to remove any potential bubbles that may have formed on the surface of the furnace. We want to do this so that we don't have any weird bubbles floating around in the mixture that is that fresh molten glass. Bubbles are typically, unless you deliberately want bubbles, where you could use baking soda and water to create bubbles, or baking soda and vinegar, sorry, to create bubbles on the surface. We typically don't want bubbles in our glass. significantly decreases the value, and they're just annoying to deal with. So now with all that fresh molten glass, it's doing the same thing, pushing the material and moving it to where he wants. Making sure to cool the tip so that the bubble doesn't blow directly to the tip. Feel free to post questions in the chat. There's always something to ask about glass, and there's a million ways to talk about different aspects in glass blowing. So feel free, far away. There's no such thing as a stupid question in glass. Right now, Steve has been reheating that bubble so that everything is the same temperature, stretching, and now he's using the jacks. The jacks are used to create constriction lines in the material, and the one that he's doing right now is very important to the process. This constriction line will allow him to remove the piece from the pipe eventually. He doesn't want to do it right now as there's more shaping to do and more material to add, but this constriction line is very important in that way. It's very annoying when you forget to put in your jack line after you've added all this material that now you have to get hot all of a sudden, and then maybe you'll ruin all the detail. So now he swung the pipe or a couple revolutions, and what that does is that it helps elongate the glass. Now he has the glass inside of the reheat chamber, boosting more heat into the surface of the glass, and using the block to cup the back end to kind of constrict and condense the material. He wants it all to be relatively the same temperature and size and even distribution. Another swing, allowing gravity to take hold on the material. You can actually watch it subtly gets longer. And everything in glass blowing is doing very subtle movements in order to drastically change how the material behaves. Okay.
How hard do you have to blow to inflate the glass?
Okay, so when it comes to glass blowing, you don't actually need a whole lot of lung power in order to inflate the glass. When the glass is very, very hot, even the subtlest amount of breath, like as if you were trying to blow out a candle, but in a very slow manner, or blowing on soup, the glass, if you were to be very violent with your breath, the glass would expand rapidly and in a very uncontrolled manner. So you don't need to blow very hard. There's very subtle movements to inflate. You only need a little bit of breath in order to keep a bubble inflated. If you were to blow very lightly, there's different ways to blow glass. When it comes to air, but typically we don't use very much lung power. You may have an advantage if you've played a wind instrument, where if if you're the assistant who's inflating the pipe from the other end, unfortunately because of COVID, we cannot do that in our studio. But if you were to do that, maybe your partner might be able to rebreathe. So you're not going to pass out when you're blowing. You should never be feeling like you're going to pass out when you're blowing glass. So now it looks like Steve's going for a sculptural addition to the piece. So as opposed to a full gather, he's doing this post gather where he only puts glass on. You can see that it's only about half, maybe 3/4 of the piece is encapsulated in that clear. Now he has this full layer. He's going to use the taglio to make a base, and then he can create creases in this fresh material. He's making the back of the owl at the moment, and the feet. There are lots of different ways to put more glass on top of bubbles. And this is just one of the ways to get a more even amount of fresh material. He could have his assistant bring bits of glass to add to the surface to create the detail. But sometimes it's something more beautiful about the subtlety that only gathering half of the bubble can create. At the moment, Steve's boosting the heat in what we call the moil. The moil is what attaches, is basically our only lifeline to attach the piece to the pipe. And if that moil starts to crack in any way or get too cold, the piece could fall off, and that would not be good. And that's one of the reasons why we constantly reheat the piece, is not only to keep it warm, but to also keep the moil warm. Now Steve's going in for another dip of glass on directly coating the same portion that he gathered on previously to add another layer. And the crease that he made earlier is an air bubble is trapped directly on top of it. So it's an extra level of depth. The taglio is a really great tool because it allows you to make these deep creases. Now he's using these casting shears to grab and tug on the material to create the tail of the owl. These little pinches are not full cuts through the glass, so you can cut glass with shears like this, but the glass has to be hotter. But he can manipulate the malleable material just by squeezing and pulling. Now he's going to try and center to make sure that the owl will stand up nice and tall and center and straight. In the meantime, he's going to have his assistant Jake babysit the piece so that it doesn't crack at any point in time, while Steve works on a new addition to the owl. In our previous demonstration with Steve's owl, he did the entire piece all by himself. And that's because it was a smaller piece. When things are smaller, it's easier to work with the material. But when it's larger like this, it really helps to have an assistant. Glass blowing is typically done with one or more people in addition to yourself. It's generally safer that way, but also more fun because you get to work with wonderful people in the studio that you work with. So Steve went ahead and he made a punty that would be used to transfer the bottom of the piece so that he can work on the top of the owl. So this will be applied to the direct bottom. Steve will guide the punty to as on center as he can for the owl. As they turn in tandem, this is the teamwork that comes into play. And it'll create a little constriction line on the punty kind of like, we call that a sculpture punty. So he cools the punty down. Make sure that it's not wobbling on Jake so that there's a nice amount of stability. And then with some cold cracks, and he's able to free the top of the piece onto the punty. Jake does a good job as a good assistant by pre-flashing the piece for Steve as Steve enters the bench and prepares whatever tool he needs next, which in this case would be the oxypropane torch. This high-powered torch uses propane and oxygen, compressed gases, to combust on the ends, and this pinpoint type of flame. He can adjust the profile of the flame how he likes. Superheat sections of the glass that may be cooler that would take longer for him to deal with inside of our reheating chamber. This super hot flame runs at about 3,500 degrees. It is much hotter than any other tool that we have available to us in the studio. But it's specialized because you can use it to heat up very specific areas. A really good reason to use it right now is because where that constriction line was a much thicker portion of glass up top. So if he were just to put it in front of our reheating chamber, it would take a really long time for that glass to heat up to a malleable state. So we can boost the heat this way, just heating up that section. So now in for another reheat. The tip of the piece is nice and glowing hot, so now we know that it's malleable. Because this is a sculpture, Steve rotates from 180 degrees every time that he's in the reheating chamber so that the piece doesn't go off center. And he's using the diamond shears, which are essentially the same thing as the straight shears, except they constrict portions of the glass to be removed. They create circular patterns as opposed to straight patterns like straight shears do. Now he's using the hot torch again to remove the cold cracks from that constriction, to make that material go back to its malleable state, to smooth out anything that might look not so good. Jake is once again raking the furnace to make sure that it doesn't have any bubbles on the surface of the crucible. And Steve's rounding out the top with his taglio so that there are no bumps or creases on the surface, because he'll be dipping the front end of the owl into the furnace. So we want to make sure that there are no bubbles that will form from that new section of glass. So he's going and dipping the front end to make the head. Tipping the pipe forward and up to make sure that the material moves where he wants so he doesn't have to fight with it. I use the taglio to redistribute that material, to smooth it out. And you can use the shears to crimp and remove any material that he doesn't want from the piece. Now we can see that this is looking much more like an owl. Glass sculpture is really amazing in that way because you can take clear molten glass from a sphere, from a ball that it naturally wants to be, and turn it into anything that you want it to be. Sometimes people use just solid glass to create sculptures. Others use bubbles. But you can make really anything out of glass. If you have an idea, it can be made. Right now, he wants to make sure that that punty is nice and warm so that it can support the weight of the piece. Now he's going to go in once again to add more detail. Looks like to the back end. Probably to make the ears or wings. As we add more material, the glass gets heavier and heavier as we work it. So as more material is added, even when you take little tiny bits of glass off like that, it really doesn't have any type of reaction to the weight. There's nothing that you'll be able to notice when you remove material like that, but when you add large amounts of material, that's when you start to feel the weight change. So our reheat chambers have these nifty doors on them. We have 2 stages of doors, and they allow us to fit larger pieces into the reheat chamber without the fear of us accidentally hitting the side of the door and getting some scuzz on the piece. That's why it's really good to have an assistant, because sometimes you might not be in the position to open the door yourself. Now he's using the hot torch and the diamond shears to sculpt the owl, to remove material. And also babysit that punty to make sure that it's nice and hot. Not moving, but just nice and warm. And when there's something funny to be said about the language that we use in glass and how we talk about glass and the language that comes from it. And so when we say cold in glass, there's a couple ways you can say that. You can cold working, which is where you physically remove the material through grinding and water through a diamond tool, or cold glass when the glass is getting cold to the point where the surface, it's still about 700 degrees or more, but the glass is still cold because it's not malleable anymore. So it looks like the piece is wrapping up. Archimedes is looking like a big old bird. Jake is suited up. He's using our Kevlar gloves, which we use to catch the glass when it gets removed from the punty, and he wants to make sure that the surface that the glass will be touching is nice and warm on his gloves. Because if the gloves are cold and he goes to grab the piece, there's a chance that the gloves are too cold to thermally shock the glass. And that would not be good. Just putting on the final touches, pulling that material. Now with final heats to try and get all the glass to be the same temperature as best as possibly can be done. If it were to be too cold and taken off, it could crack. If it's too hot, it might slump in the kiln or get misshapen by the gloves. So we want to make sure that everything is nice and even in its heat. He's using a little bit of water with these straight shears to pour water in between where the piece is and the punty. And the piece is broken free.
Behind you.
So now we're walking over to our annealing oven. And I can talk a little bit about how that process goes. So now that the piece is happily inside the annealing oven, this will be sent down over a course about 24 hours. Inside, this maintains at about 918 degrees. Lots of different programs that you can put into our computer. But this one specifically is designed to bring the glass down from its pre-molten state at 900 degrees all the way down to room temperature. If we didn't do that and we let the glass out in the open atmosphere, the glass would shrink too much around itself and ultimately crack. So in order to, that's how everything in glass is made. You have to make sure that everything is annealed. For example, here at the museum, we have in front of our history section, we have a glass bench that is 3 feet of casted material. This was sand casted, and in order for this material to be fully annealed, it needed roughly about 11 months to fully cool from 918 degrees to room temperature. And if we see that there's actually a crack that's formed inside the bench, and that proves that there wasn't enough time taken between the 11 months that we needed to cool that it took to cool the bench. In comparison, if you think about the Hubble telescope lens, that was casted, I believe, at least 2 to 3 times, and that's because the thickness of the lens, they needed to develop a way to pool this glass into their molds and anneal it over I believe it took about 3 years for the lens to cast. And the first time they did it, it cracked because it was too hot in the center and it cooled too quickly on the edges, and that's what caused it to crack. Well, I hope that you enjoyed our glass art demonstration. Thank you. We'll be having more great art escape demonstrations happening tomorrow. I believe the first demonstration will be happening at 12 o'clock, so you can come in and stay tuned with us. If you like what you saw during our demonstration, you can share it with friends and family. We'd really like to hear what you have to say about our demonstrations, and we hope to see you tomorrow for the end of our great art escape. Thank you and have a good night.